When I studied economics at school, we were taught that there were three factors of production, namely land, that is, nature, labour, and capital, that is, manufactured means of labour. Each was supposed to be a distinct contribution to the production process and receive a just return as rent, wages, and profits. But of course, when Adam delved and Eve span, the labour process included the spade and the soil, the spinning wheel and the wool. These did not have a separate supplier or yield a separable return. As Marx asks, how does this strange phenomenon arise that we find on the market a set of buyers possessed of land, machinery, raw material, and the means of subsistence, all of them, save land in its crude state, the products of labour, and on the other hand, a set of sellers who have nothing to sell except their labouring power, their working arms and brains? That the one set buys continually in order to make a profit and enrich themselves, while the other set continually sells in order to earn their livelihood. The inquiry into this question would be an inquiry into what the economists call previous or original accumulation, but which ought to be called original expropriation. We should find that this so-called original accumulation means nothing but a series of historical processes resulting in a decomposition of the original union existing between the labouring man and his instruments of labour. Such an inquiry, however, lies beyond the pale of my present subject. The separation between the man of labour and the instruments of labour once established, such a state of things will maintain itself and reproduce itself upon a constantly increasing scale, until a new and fundamental revolution in the mode of production should again overrun it and restore the original union in a new historical form. Selected works in one volume. Apologists of capitalism have given an account that makes it look as if, whatever we think of capitalism now, its origins are just. And there are still political philosophers today who think that a just distribution is one that has come about by free contracts from a just starting point. This is the view of Robert Nozick and his followers. The classical account goes like this. Originally, all were equal, but some worked hard and saved what they earned, while others were lazy or spendthrift. The former came to own capital, the latter not, and the latter, or their descendants, ended up as propertyless proletarians working for the former. Actually, it is not at all clear that this is even coherent. In a non-money economy, one could not accumulate capital. If you worked harder than your neighbour and produced more meat and vegetables, you might have a bigger Christmas dinner, but you could not keep them long. Saving presupposes money, and money presupposes that people already have power over the labour of others, for that is just what money is. However, Marx is not here concerned to prove that this just primitive accumulation could not have taken place, but simply that it did not. The process by which a class of proletarians without the means of labour came to exist alongside a class of capitalists with those means was very different. In the first place, though individual production did exist in the pre-capitalist world, there was not an economy of independent equals. The starting point of the process was another class society, feudalism. When serfs became legally free, in late medieval England, for example, they did not become equals with their lords, but tenants or, in some cases, wage labourers, most of whom would have had a few acres of land to farm on their own account. They may have had more independence than a proletarian, but they were a relatively underprivileged class and were exploited through rent and interest. Marx's main concern, though, is with the next stage in the history, the way free peasants and artisans of the late Middle Ages were transformed into wage labourers. This started to happen in England first of all in the Tudor period. In insolent conflict with king and parliament, the great feudal lords created an incomparably larger proletariat by the forcible driving of the peasantry from the land, to which the latter had the same feudal rights as the lord himself, and by the usurpation of the common lands. Capital, Volume 1. The motive for this was the growth of the wool trade. Peasants who ploughed the land and ate what they raised were evicted from their lands and driven away from their villages, which became depopulated, while the lords turned the land into pasture for sheep, supporting a much smaller population, but yielding a much greater profit. Successive kings tried unsuccessfully to halt this process. On the other hand, the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII aggravated it, since lands which had been responsibly farmed were bought up by speculators and were depopulated for wool production. This process meant that tens of thousands of previously more or less independent yeomen were deprived of a livelihood, a place to live, and the security of the village community on which they would otherwise have relied in time of need. They had no alternative but to head for the towns, seek work as wage labourers, or, failing to find it, to become vagabonds and beggars. Perhaps the most shameful feature of this whole history of expropriation is the way the state authorities treated these vagabonds. By Henry VIII's statute of 1530, they are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies, then to swear an oath to go back to their birthplace or to where they have lived the last 3 years, and to put themselves to labour. For the third offence, they were to be executed. The option of going back to their birthplace was of course not on, since their villages had often been razed to the ground, and not enough work was available in the towns. The stupid cast of mind behind this legislation we can still recognise well enough today in those who advocate harsher treatment of the unemployed as a remedy for unemployment, and write leaders in self-styled quality papers to this effect. But the brutality of the punishments beggars belief. Elizabeth I and James I passed similarly brutal laws. The process of expropriating the peasants did not stop with the Tudors. It was resumed on a massive scale in Scotland in the 18th century Highland clearances. Heads of clans who were traditionally the nominal holders of clan land started treating the land as their private property and evicting its population to make way for deer forests. Forest here has its older sense of a place where deer may be hunted. No tree planting took place. This they did with the support of the Whig oligarchy and the English army. This was still going on in the early 19th century. Marx tells of the Duchess of Sutherland, who appropriated 794,000 acres of clan land, and between 1814 and 1820 evicted 15,000 inhabitants, having their houses burnt down. One old woman who refused to leave was burnt to death in her house. The process resumed in England too in the 18th century, with the enclosure of land, whereby the rural population lost the commons where they had traditionally been able to collect wood and graze animals. Marx goes on to discuss briefly the origin of the capitalist farmer, developing from the feudal bailiff to the large tenant farmer, and profiting too from the enclosures of the 18th century. He points out how the dispossession of the peasants facilitated capitalism not only by creating a propertyless proletariat, but by depriving the rural population of the ability to grow their own food, thus creating a home market. And he traces the origin of the industrial capitalist not so much in the successful craftsman as in the merchant or banker who set up industry outside the guild-regulated towns. Further primitive accumulation came about through the slave trade and the exploitation of Asian countries. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed, for its pedestal, slavery pure and simple in the New World. In the chapter called Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation, Marx fleshes out historically the point he makes in the passage I quote at the outset of the book. In the immediate pre-capitalist phase, there were many peasants and craftsmen who owned their own means of labour, and thus were free in the work process, though they may have been exploited by landlords, merchants, and usurers. Capitalism expropriates some by force and drives others out of business by competition, concentrating the means of production more and more into fewer and fewer hands. This process has advantages: cooperative labour, the application of science to production, but at the expense of the mass of people who lose their freedom. Marx looks forward to this mass of people eventually expropriating the expropriators. The capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labour of the proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a law of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of negation. This does not re-establish private property for the producer, but gives him individual property based on the acquisitions of the capitalist era, i.e., on cooperation and the possession in common of the land and of means of production. The transformation of scattered private property arising from individual labour into capitalist private property is, naturally, a process incomparably more protracted, violent, and difficult than the transformation of capitalistic private property, already practically resting on socialized production, into socialized property. In the former case, we had the expropriation of the mass of the people by a few usurpers. In the latter, we have the expropriation of a few usurpers by the mass of the people. Finally, Marx comes to another test case between his thinking and that of capitalist ideologists. The case of the colonies, in the traditional sense of the word, namely Australia and New Zealand. Capitalists took capital and workers to the colonies, only to discover that, since land was freely available, the workers rapidly transformed themselves into independent farmers and artisans, and the capital was no use since it could not buy labour power. Apologists of capitalism see capital as the rightful property of the capitalist, ownership of which in no way encroaches on the rights of anyone else. But capital is useless if there are no propertyless proletarians whose labour power it can buy. A certain Mr. Peel, who took with him to Australia £50,000 of capital and 3,000 proletarians, found when he arrived that he was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. As Marx comments, he discovered that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons, established by the instrumentality of things. In the mythology of capitalism, it differs from slavery and serfdom in that the capitalist's domination is not over people, but only over property. But it is a form of property that is only useful if it buys domination over people. What made capitalist relations impossible in Mr. Peel's situation? Simply the individual property of the workers. So, individual property and capital, which are seen in capitalist propaganda as the same thing, are mutually incompatible. Consequently, those who wanted to re-establish capitalist relations of production in the colonies came up with the idea that the price of land there should be artificially raised above its market price to keep the workers exploitable, which lets the cat out of the bag about the supposed naturalness of capitalism. What does this part of Capital, the final and perhaps the most easily readable part, actually prove? It certainly alters one's perception of English history. Henry VIII was not just beastly to his wives and counsellors, but to the poor among his people too. Elizabeth I didn't just kill Catholics and Baptists, but the chronically unemployed too. It also certainly proves that capitalism is not a natural system, but depends historically upon the violent seizure of the means of life from the greater part of the people. But does it prove that capitalism today is unjust? After all, we know that Bristol and Liverpool were built on the proceeds of the slave trade, but we do not conclude that those two great cities should be bulldozed down. The evil of the slave trade, that slave trade, is dead, and we rejoice both in its death and in any good that it might have left behind it. One might accuse Marx of the genetic fallacy. That is, the idea that facts about the origin of something determine the value of it. But I think this would be mistaken. Marx is not saying that capitalism is bad because its origin is bad. That it is bad, whatever its origin, he has documented elsewhere, for instance in the chapter on the working day. But what he has done in this part of Capital is demolish an argument for capitalism, which itself rests on the genetic fallacy, namely, that which both the economists of his time and the recent philosophy of Robert Nozick offer, that capitalism is the consequence of a series of just transactions, and is therefore itself just.